Welcome back to the Agentic Insider. I'm your host, Philip Swan. In this show, we explore cutting-edge ideas and trends in AI and data, as well as hear from other industry thought leaders in the AI space. This podcast is brought to you by Iridius AI, committed to safe and responsible AI innovation. Let's dig in. Welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of the Agentic Insider with me and my co-host, Alistair. Is an amazing human who is based out of Canada, and he is a manufacturing expert. He is very familiar with operational technologies and AI, and hosts his own podcast. Welcome, Vladimir Romanov, to the Agentic Insider.
Thank you so much for having me.
So when we first started talking, our teams, two people on our team independently said, "You got to get Vlad Romanov on our podcast because he's amazing." They listen to your podcast, and I've listened to subsequent episodes. And phenomenal job that you and Dave do.
Thank you so much.
My question to you is, and obviously I would encourage everybody to go out and listen to the Manufacturing Hub, which is the name of the podcast. But I'd love to know, what future are you solving for, Vlad?
That is a really good question, right? So I know that we've talked a little bit about this off the podcast, but ultimately my belief, right, and my intuition is that a lot of the economic wealth, I would say, in the at least North American market over the history or over the years has been built through manufacturing. And I would argue that, again, there's going to be different opinions and political views into which we're not going to get into. I would say over the last couple of years to the pandemic and even further, I believe we have lost that advantage, right? And for decisions, again, that I think don't necessarily need to be discussed today, I think we need to be bringing back that manufacturing powerhouse back to our markets. And that's only going to be possible through technology, right? I think back in the days, it was due to an advantage of cheaper labor. I think that the only way that we can compete right now is through technology, right? And it's through automation, robotics, AI, vision systems, and everything, I guess, that surrounds those ecosystems. So to answer your question, I guess, more directly, I believe that we're going to have a lot more manufacturing, whether that's, bringing back certain companies or whether that's rebuilding certain skills that we have lost over the decades. So the future that I'm solving for is trying to educate, trying to provide integration capabilities, and ultimately trying to bring manufacturing back to the North American market.
So taking that forward, so how do you see the opportunities with AI to allow people to innovate better, to get to market faster, and actually to be able to sort of manufacture goods over here in a way that is competitive, ignoring the current political climate, you want to be able to be competitive with people anyway. So how do you see that as something that's going to really stand out and people leveraging it over here?
I think that currently we're in this period of experimentation, right? I think everyone is, at this point, I would assume, is sold on the advantages of AI, right? Whether they're using it maybe for their own personal use, whether they're using it at work, but I think everyone understands that it will drastically change all areas of work, right? From finance to HR to whatever you name it, manufacturing, plant floor, operations. So the way I see it is it's going to, of course, impact different areas in very different ways, right? And so I like to break it down, I guess, for manufacturing specifically. There's going to be areas before machines hit the production floor. There's going to be areas while, operations are actually running machines. And then there's going to be, I want to say, auxiliary functions, right? So again, like HR, hiring, finance, managing bookkeeping, supply chain, right? So I think there's a lot of examples, and we can expand on all of them, but I think it's going to drastically change every single area. And if we're not up to speed on it, we're simply are not going to be able to win on that front. Like I said, that is required for us to compete on the global market.
So I'd like to double click on that just a little bit more, and especially looking towards OT, or operational technology systems. how do you see AI agents fitting into the traditional manufacturing hierarchy, right? And what resistance have you encountered when introducing autonomous decision-making systems?
Sure. And I guess I can draw from personal experience, right? So right now, if you walk into, I want to say most facilities, what you're going to find is, I would like to say, mostly obsolete systems, right? So it's still very difficult, I would say, for most manufacturers to pull data from their equipment to understand how it is running, right? So I want to say, like, that's probably one of the main, I want to say, constraints on the manufacturers today. But once that is unlocked, AI can then analyze a lot of that information. And right, and we can maybe distinguish also, is that AI on the LLM side, or is that more traditional, machine learning, where when applied to numerical and statistical information? But ultimately, I have spent personally multiple, months, years on plant floors, just contextualizing data so it can be extracted and then, sent to a database. Because right now, there is no better solution as to how you could understand that information, how you could, again, pull it out into an architecture that makes sense. And then how do you draw conclusions? Well, again, it is mostly tribal knowledge, right? So having been on the plant floor a certain amount of years, you can start saying, well, this is the bottleneck because we've seen it at a different factory. And so I would assume that with AI, that process is going to be a lot more streamlined, but also a lot more applicable between, different facilities as it scales.
Philip and I talk a lot about agentifying data, but in some ways, if we're able to agentify the machines that are on the factory floor so that we can extract that data from them and publish it in a way that makes sense. And then, you have agents that can understand what the machine is doing and how it works. Then you're able to pull these. And then, as you say, the operators and so on have the nuances. Just because this happened to go 3 degrees above the control temperature is normal. That machine gets hot. It's how it happens. But that sort of contextual data is also super important that you wouldn't get if you just used an agent to pull that information out. So I think that tribal knowledge, okay, is so crucial in all of this to overlay over that.
Absolutely, 100%. And I would say, as we deploy these systems, it's going to be also very important to go through the process of validation. I believe that, and I guess I've been burnt with this before with non-AI systems where, you deploy a software solution and it's simply deployed in a way that maybe doesn't solve the problem, and it gets quote unquote blamed for reasons other than the system itself, right? And I'll give you an example. If you have a plant that is running a, I want to say, network that is not up to speed or not up to the architecture that you would need to pull that data, well, ultimately, if you deploy a tool that's a SCADA or an MES that does not solve some or does not capture data correctly, it's important to realize where the problem was. It's not because the AI has failed or the tool has failed. It was really because you need to go through the process of deploying these systems correctly. So I think once we get there, there's no doubt in my mind there will be gains to be had on the production side.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that, when Philip and I have talked to our manufacturing partners and so on and customers around this, the conversation isn't about making, there's two parts when you have any machine on our factory floor. If we go down to that level, you've got the actual machine and then you've got the operator. Okay. And so as part of that, if you just agentify the machine without agentifying the operator and what they know, then ultimately you're missing half the intelligence that comes with all of this. And I think that's the piece here, the human intelligence and how to be able to, not just from one machine, but from multiple machines and how they operate together. Okay, that sort of thing is going to be important as well. So as you look to build out systems, you've got to be able to think about the human communication that's going between the people on the floor and operating the machines in order to be able to find a way to get that information out at the same time.
100%, right? And I think a lot of, I guess I've seen a lot of demos of solutions who are trying to solve this sort of change management challenge because you need to have that information. This can also, relate to the quote unquote problem of the aging workforce, right? I keep hearing different parties talk about that. And the reality is, I don't have an answer. Let's say, how do we capture their knowledge that is inside of their brain easier, right? Do we start recording conversations? Do we start having them take more notes? How do we actually maybe get some of that information out of the quote unquote operators and those interacting with the machines so that we can have that body of knowledge that can be then processed, through AI and combined with the context of the technical data being pulled from the machine.
So you touched on MES systems. right, which are manufacturing execution systems, right? And looking at SCADA, MES systems, you're talking about orchestration, like releasing orders and sequences and load balancing and tracking real-time data on machines and everything, and everything else. How do you envision beyond simple automation, that these AI agents become true decision-making partners in manufacturing environments?
So, look, right now, SCADA and MES systems are pure data visualization tools, right? They are just tools that allow whomever as the stakeholder to look at the data and to understand better what's happening. SCADA, I would argue, is more real time and more process and sort of current data oriented. MES is more, I want to say, historical, right? A lot of times you want to look at a weekly report by shift, or by month or even by year to understand how the performance has been. But ultimately, humans are the ones making the decisions on as to what needs to be done, right? And of course, like I said, on the SCADA side, maybe something has failed, there's an alarm that comes out, I'm going to go to the machine and figure out what I need to do next. On the MES side, it could be, hey, we've done this well or this poorly over the last 3 months, here's our next plan for the next quarter. So to your question, AI, or I guess like humans, I would say, are not good at processing multivariate information, right? So again, if I have the context of the factory and if I've been there for many years, I'd argue I probably would have a bias towards how we've always done things, right? And on the flip side, if I'm new to the factory, I probably don't have the body of knowledge of the people who have been there for many years, if not decades. So I think on either sides, humans are almost a weak point on how to make that decision. So in my experience, I think we can make that a lot better by, again, absorbing a lot of that information, a lot of that data, but also, again, textualized or string-based data that is coming out of, as you've mentioned, from operators, from comments. You could be pulling in customer information, customer complaints, right? So none of that, as far as I know, is pulled into SCADA or MES. So the ability to ingest from all of those different sources, I think, is going to be huge.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, absolutely spot on. I mean, I remember when SCADA first, was first released into the wild, which was many, many moons ago, and the amount of transformation that happened, which kind of leads into, because you've got your own podcast, the Manufacturing Hub, right? And I've listened to it where you've gone into the reality of AI versus the hype in industrial settings, right? So can you share some specific examples of where agents have genuinely transformed manufacturing operations versus instances where the tech got oversold and was just like, was a very expensive failure?
Honestly, I think that question would be difficult for me to answer. I think that the agents that I see on the manufacturing side are mostly coming in from the OEMs. And the examples are such that, they're obviously deploying them alongside of their machines to a lot of times contextualize and extract the data that they need to make their machines better. For the most part, from what I hear, and as you know, a lot of that data is proprietary. It has been successful for them, but I would say that the failures are not necessarily related to AI or even agents. I think my comments on that side are more related to the state of manufacturing that I see today, right? I think, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's a lot of obsolete equipment. There's a lot of obsolete protocols. There's still I want to say, challenge to extract information that we would need to even utilize those agents. I can give you on the compliance side, right? I've been to food and beverage facilities that are FDA regulated, and they're storing data on a local machine that fails, twice a week. And despite them having a need to provide that information over, if I'm not mistaken, it's 5 years for the food product they're manufacturing, they simply don't have the architecture and they don't have the IT, I want to say, environment to be able to do that, right? So the challenges, I would say, are less so based on agents and AI. The challenges are more so based on the current equipment, at least that I'm working with, right? And I want to put a caveat to that. There are companies that are a little bit more cutting edge. And of course, the challenges they experience are going to be different as well.
So, I mean, we're talking about competitiveness here, and how can we make the country more competitive from a manufacturing perspective? And so, obviously being able to embrace these, as you said, there's you call up three different ways of making, AI, a little bit more integrated into the manufacturing process and the supply chain. I think, you talked about auxiliary, for example, from bookkeeping to marketing and things like that, which is absolutely going to happen. But where do you think the biggest opportunities are for manufacturing or, companies to be able to really take a leap forward here? And I guess a part question to that is, smaller manufacturers really, they have to invest a lot to be able to get that manufacturing going. Okay, and so their ability to really be able to invest heavily is not the same as the bigger organizations. So do you think you're going to see the innovation coming from the smaller ones, or do you think it's going to be out of their reach to be able to go and do those things? Or is AI democratizing it well enough that the smaller ones may well be able to become more competitive?
There's a lot of questions there, right? So let me try my best to break that down a little bit. So I think that different size manufacturers have vastly different problems, right? And what I mean by that is, again, having worked for P&G and Kraft Heinz, I can tell you that they're trying to get that 0.1% OE, which means millions of dollars to them, right? So every site is going to be optimized on that last tiny percentage of overall equipment effectiveness. Smaller manufacturers, the story is very different, right? They're running at 30, maybe 40% OE, and they're trying to just, I don't want to say stay afloat, but ultimately they're trying to make sure production is met. They're trying to make sure that the pallets go out the door. So the challenges of optimizing their factories are very different from the larger ones. As you mentioned, the capitals are also very different. I can tell you, and this is no secret, there's a lot of research centers for the larger manufacturers where they can, quite frankly, pour capital in and test out any solution on the market, right? Whether that solution solves a big enough problem for them and is actually deployed from the R&D center to the production floor is a whole other question, right? So I can tell you, using an example of even drones and delivering, packages within a site, it was tested, right? They tried to do it. It never got pushed to the production floors in actual facilities. So again, I think solution by solution, they will go and they will put money into different R&D projects, they will validate, and they will deploy onto their production floors. I think for smaller manufacturers, again, the opportunity is going to have to be different because they will have to almost test and house test on their own production. And I think, again, taking a big step back, manufacturing, I think, is, how would I say it? If you paint a very high level picture, a simple business, right? So we need to produce a widget, we need to sell the widget, so we need to find customers, and then we need to deliver that widget to whomever that is. It's a distribution center or it's, direct to consumer. So ultimately, how do they optimize any or all of those areas, right? So again, on the sales side, I think everyone, and I had a conversation with a fairly large systems integrator earlier today, they're using AI tools. I think every single interaction that they have on the customer side, they're already doing it, right? To what success, I think everyone is still measuring or trying to figure that out. The next step, is, as we discussed, building that widget or producing that widget. I think there's a lot of components that go into that. Is it a problem that they have with scrap? Is it a problem that they have with, just throughput? Is it a problem they have with a specific bottleneck? I think all of those areas can be addressed. Depends on the vertical, right? Depends on the company, depends again on the size and their budget. But I think all of them will be impacted by AI in one way or another. I've talked to a group that's working on, applying AI to CAD drawings. I've talked to groups that are trying to apply AI again to data and trying to pull data out of a unified namespace or historian, right? So I think even those solutions are vastly different, but they will impact manufacturing. And I guess how much it costs to make that widget at the end of the day, which ultimately impacts the bottom line for that specific manufacturer.
In many ways, you're talking about seeing if there's an opportunity to be able to improve from an efficiency perspective. Okay, what about creativity? What about the idea of coming up with new ideas, new business lines? Okay, and being able to then bring those to market more rapidly. Do you see an opportunity here for people to be able to accelerate that creative process and bring things to market faster because of that, rather than just the efficiency side?
I think that's an interesting question, right? So I would say I've always been a more of an operational person rather than a pure creative. But I can tell you, for example, having worked with product people at again P&G and Kraft, there is a push to being able to, I guess, change over faster, but ultimately work on different products as much as you can, and shortening that batch period as much as we can, and develop different SKUs and be able to push out different SKUs to the teams that are purchasing. So I would say there is definitely an opportunity. I think there's a lot of manual labor that is spent to understand how that is done currently. So I would say, yes, there's an opportunity, but I would assume there needs to be a longer conversation, maybe with someone on the branding or product side that understands a little bit better what it takes and how that can be improved.
So one of the things we haven't spoken about, Vlad and Alistair, is especially when we're talking about OT or operational technology, right? We're not talking general purpose computers. We're talking PLCs. We're talking embedded systems, IoT devices, etc. So what's the challenge that you're seeing with your manufacturers as they make their systems more and more connected? What security concerns are they having, and how are they addressing them?
There's, I guess you mentioned one of the issues, which are security concerns. There's, I would say, a couple more, right? So number one, I would say that a lot of the OT systems are highly proprietary, right? It is not always easy to just pull out the information or the data that you would want to utilize at the IT layers. A lot of manufacturers have a very fragmented stack, right? What do I mean by that? Well, again, depending on your purchasing power, if you're a smaller to medium-sized, let's say, food production facility, you're basically at the mercy of the OEMs, right? So you're going to get a machine from Europe that's going to have one type of PLC and IPC and whatever else inside of it. You're going to get another machine from, Asia that's going to have another different machine or manufacturer. So they have a lot of problems when it comes to just tying in the different I guess OT infrastructure, and I want to say that's only the surface of that problem, right? Because then you are also hiring individuals with different skill sets to be able to maintain those machines. And that kind of trickles into having a lower, again, OE because you have more breakdowns. So there's that whole side of things. But going back maybe to the cybersecurity component, again, I still go to manufacturers that are, their VP teams are looking to deploy or test out AI solutions, and they're looking to figure out how can we improve security. And once I show up on site and have a conversation with the plant manager or the engineering manager, I'm very, how would I say, surprised to hear that they're still using Windows 98 machines, right? And that's because they're running, very old SCADA systems, and they simply cannot migrate. And I don't want to blame the plant teams um, either, because they're basically are just there to some extent to support what was given to them. So I think it's a huge challenge. They're trying to find budgets. They're trying to justify it via, as you said, maybe it's a security initiative, maybe it's a efficiency initiative, maybe it's a data initiative. So someone's looking to understand it better. But regardless, even if they wanted to solve that challenge tomorrow, it is quite frankly impossible, right? You need those months, if not years, of engineering effort, and quite a heavy budget to solve those problems on the OT side.
It is a really big problem. Uh, I've run two security firms, and we were heavily involved with critical infrastructure, and so it was something we dealt with every single day, and the challenges thereupon. Um, which really goes into, I'm really curious about Industry 4.0 and how that applies here, is because Industry 4.0 has been this it's been going on for some time now in terms of how it's defined and how it's being implemented. How are you seeing the Industry 4.0 initiatives incorporating AI, and what are people struggling with?
Yeah, so look, in a nutshell, the way I see Industry 4.0, because ultimately, depending on whom you talk to, if it's someone on the plant floor, if it's a decision maker, they're going to, I want to say, have a different opinion on what that truly means. The way I always tell people is, regardless of what you believe, I think it's now cheaper than ever to get data out of the plant floor, right? Whether that's on the hardware side, on the software side. We can talk about SCADA, MES, historians, UNS, right? There's a lot of different acronyms that fall under Industry 4.0, but ultimately it's allowing everyone to make quote unquote better decisions, right? Whether you're implementing it correctly or you're making mistakes, that's a whole other conversation. But ultimately, you should be able to make better decisions with the data you have. And there's a ton of opportunities in the data that you're collecting. Now, what does AI solve, in my opinion, is the gap between, again, I think there's a lot of really smart people that can extract the data and then store it either in a database or a quote unquote unified namespace or in the cloud. Again, we can talk about Snowflake, AWS. Everyone has a solution where you can store data. I believe, or at least what I'm seeing, is that a lot of that data is underutilized, right? So I think that humans are still very, how would I say it? They don't have the right ability to parse that data and then make decisions based on the data and actually realize the ROI that is sometimes, I want to say, utilized to make those purchases. So I think AI is going to bridge that gap very quickly and actually come in and help the manufacturers, realize the ROI that was not necessarily there when a very, again, competent integrator integrated everything and kind of left them with a lot of data to look at.
So, if sorry, Alistair, I've got one more follow up on this. Is we talk a lot internally at Iridius about agent to agent interaction, human to agent interaction, agent to human interaction, human to human negotiations. So tying this back into Industry 4.0, how do you see agents solving supply chain communication, data exchange challenges in some of these human to human negotiations that are currently being struggled? They're a challenge for these companies.
Well, I think, look, those interactions are going to continue to be a challenge, at least in the near future, in my mind, in different areas in manufacturing, right? Not just supply chain, but also operation, maintenance. I think specifically for supply chain, again, I discussed a little bit that once the components, the widgets are manufactured, they do need to be sent to different distribution centers. And depending on what your company makes and the size of your company, it's either going to be very large distributors, right? So again, I mentioned in my experience with P&G, they're just pretty much selling to Walmart, Target, and a few other like big suppliers. So a lot of times their negotiation is very, how would I put it? It's their way, or there's no negotiation really. For smaller manufacturers, as you mentioned, that challenge is a lot bigger because ultimately they have much thinner margins. And so they're trying to articulate how their product is going to be, I want to say, like purchased by the consumer at the end of the day from the distributor or the party that's going to be, I guess, handling the shipping and receiving and the sales. So I would assume that the conversations with the agents, I don't know, to be honest with you, depending on how the buyers implement their own agents, how those conversations are going to go. But hopefully there will be some benefit for the manufacturer as well.
So I just want to switch gears a little and ask a different sort of question. So it's very general, but imagine you're a manufacturer because you consult with so many of these and you talk to so many of these on your podcast and others. Where would you put your money now if you wanted to use it to try and invest around AI? Skills of people, types of AI. Where would you've got a limited amount of money depending on the size of your organization, no matter what it is. Where would you put your money? What are you looking to try first?
Oh, that is a very, very difficult question. So I think that the first area that I would improve is, again, looking at where my struggles are, would probably be sales. I think that a lot of manufacturers, before you can optimize the shop floor, you need to have the demand. And I think that a lot of them are still struggling to get orders. And whether that's a manufacturer, like I said, that's making the final product, or they're a second or third tier supplier, or if they're a co-packer, I think that there's a lot of improvements to be made on just getting more orders through the door. Once, we have optimized that process, I think that the next logical step is to look at our operation, right? So again, we want to be making whatever we are making at the lowest price possible. And this is usually manufacturers would know that number if they are collecting the minimal amount of data. They should be able to tell you, well, we're making a can or a box or a pallet for X amount of dollars. And I would be investing a lot of money into reducing that price as much as possible, because ultimately that's your margin on the product once it is sold to whomever. So I think those would be the two main areas that I would be looking at. I would also caution, I want to say, manufacturers that have not dabbled probably with AI. Like I said, my opinion is they should be running very fast sprints and MVPs with different solutions, because I think, again, there's a lot of change management problems that I see, at least, where you need to educate the people. What's your new workflow? How do we use this? And I think it does take time in our industry, right? Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, depending on how you look at it, it's important to train the people to do things right. It's important for them to gain trust. It's important for them to see that, hey, I'm saving now X amount of hours in my workflow per week, so I could be focused, or just delivering more value to the organization. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. I think the people change management, I mean, this is very near and dear to my heart in all of this as well. And I think you're right that people have to be helped through this, okay, in order to be able to understand, the value to the organization, why they need to change, why now, okay, and what specifically how it, well, what's in it for them in order for them to be able to make the trip to go through these changes. Again, it's interesting that the first thing you call out is nothing to do really with the operational side. That came in later. The first thing is to fix the sales side. So for you to say that, I'm guessing you're seeing a more significant problem with the sales side of things at the moment and bringing in more orders, or at least, it's a marketing problem where they're not able to articulate the value of their product as to why their product is better than somebody else's. And even if their one is slightly more expensive, there is more, ROI to be had from investing in it. That I guess that's where you're coming from here.
Right. And again, I just want to make sure that, I spend a little bit less time on that side, but what I see on the production floors is a lot of downtime, I guess, related to the fact that there's just no order to be ran on those specific lines, right? So the reality for me is that there is quite a bit of equipment that is just sitting there being underutilized. And you can say, well, it's underutilized for reason XYZ, but ultimately it's because there's not enough orders coming in, especially on the small to medium sized manufacturers. So I think that the tools there also have been very proven and are easier to implement, because it's more on the IT and application side. So it has already been showcased to provide a lot of benefit for them. And so I would urge them to, start there and improve their sales process. And as that work queue comes in, that's when you should start looking at your equipment.
But it goes beyond just sales, right? It's marketing too, because I remember not that long ago, I had 3 functioning factories for a consumer packaged goods company that I owned. And one of the big things is I was looking for other manufacturers. They do a really poor job of marketing themselves. They're hard to find. And so I think one of the areas where AI could help them, in addition to sales, is actually on the marketing side, or how they promote themselves to find that business.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I apologize, right? Sometimes I bundle sort of the sales and marketing into one, right? Making sure that you're reaching out and you're calling the potential customers. But yes, it's also marketing of your product and how you sort of present yourself. And yes, absolutely. There's a lot of improvements and opportunities on that side when it comes to AI.
Because look, we've got fixed operating costs for all of that wonderful equipment they've got, sitting on their floor. And being able to use them is like an aircraft. The more you use it, the more cost effective it is. And so when you start looking to some practical cost conscious approaches, how do you evaluate ROI of agentic implementations, and what metrics would you use to distinguish, between worthwhile investments and expensive, let's just call them experiments?
So again, very tough question, right? So at the end of the day, I think in manufacturing, I want to say in most cases, right, because I don't want to draw any absolutes, there is a reasonable way to measure out what is currently being, how would I say it, spent on, let's say, a specific line. How much does it cost to run the specific line in terms of energy, in terms of personnel, in terms of, productivity? So in a general sense, the manufacturer should be able to answer, right? And like I said, not all of them can, but what does it take to run their operation in different areas? So how are projects evaluated? Well, someone needs to be able to, I guess, make a claim or make a statement after an assessment to say, hey, we're able to either, improve your productivity by a certain percentage or a number of dollars. We can reduce the amount of, operator hours spent on that specific line because of maybe lesser quality defects, or, we can eliminate, again, like maybe waste for a specific reason. We can reduce energy because we've monitored the energy. So ultimately, if there is a claim being made, you should be able to say, well, it's going to take us 3 months. Here's what it's going to cost us. Here's what it's supposed to return. If it's, again, depending on the size of the company, I've been in large organizations. So if for them, if the payback period is, less than 9 to 12 months, it's going to be a green light. If it's going to be more than that, it's a red light. So it is not, I would say, not that complicated from that standpoint to evaluate. What gets a lot more murkier, of course, is actually proving that percentage delivered by AI. Because again, there's a lot of different, I want to say, pieces that need to fall into place. I think that in most cases, it's not going to be the technology that's the problem, right? It's like we discussed, it's going to be people actually utilizing it to its fullest potential. Again, there's problems that I see all the time on the networking side, right? So if the data is not being passed correctly or presented correctly to the decision makers for that reason, they're going to very easily say, well, we've not been able to realize the ROI from this specific project, but it's not because of that project, right? It's really because of the architecture it was built on. So I think that's where the nuances and how things will actually play out is going to be, or is currently being discussed, and is very interesting. So I don't necessarily have specific maybe answers on that side. As you know, a lot of projects are fairly secretive when it comes to that.
I agree, but I think as well, part of this comes from the ROI comes from, how much of the ROI is going to come from the technology itself. So there are some things like, installing a cable between two things that didn't have one. Okay, that doesn't need an awful lot of human involvement because you plug the cable in. But there are other things, to your point about learning how to use a new machine, a piece of equipment, okay, or using it to its fullest potential, which is a very different thing. I think that moves away from just the knowledge of how to use it to actually being able to be an expert and using it to its fullest potential. I think that, with the ability to really understand where's the ROI coming from, I think this is something, or it feels to me that when a manufacturer is getting, which they will be, every single company that they deal with coming to them and going, good news, we now have an AI widget that we didn't have before that's going to make everything about what you're doing, so much better than it was. And they're going to want to attribute every single possible, change to coming solely from the introduction of that widget. I think it's important for companies to understand the ROI and how much is coming from the tech compared to the people side of this change.
Yeah, that's going to be a very, very difficult question, I think, to answer. And I think what's going to be really interesting too, right? And I've experienced this even within the same company, is different sites are going to behave vastly differently, right? What I mean by that is, again, one site I go to has a full engineering team that's fully capable of understanding and deploying fairly complex systems. The same, the sister site that's producing the same exact product has a vastly different team that is going to be a lot more different to train. So how do you evaluate, deploying a technical solution to one side versus the other and not realizing the same ROI? As you said, I think it's going to be very complex, and a lot of conversations are going to be had around that. And to be honest with you, I'd be very curious to see the data, because I think data speaks very loudly. And I think a lot of companies will not be publishing that data because, again, it's very, how would I say it, cutting edge, and they want to have that advantage for themselves. But I would be extremely curious to have more of those conversations.
I would too, and I think it's when you talk about the data, I think it's important. You're talking about two different factories or two different plants making the same thing, but the cultures being very different for whatever the reason is. And so, if they don't have the data that shows the culture is different, or they can't very quickly understand it, then they may try the same approach to deploy it and try that change in both places. And in one of them, it might succeed, and in one of them, it may not. And I think that's why, it has to be adaptive to the change, okay, in terms of the culture and the people that it's going to. And we all know, I mean, you're from Canada, okay. Philip and I are living in the northwest of America, but my accent's not, okay. We've lived all around the world, all of us have, okay. And so we end up realizing that there are many cultures and many different types of people, even in the same city, okay, and in plants in different parts. and just in the way that they've grown up and that as organizations. So I think that that really does make a huge difference, and gathering that data on how the people are and relates to the technology is so huge in this.
Yes, absolutely.
So, as we start to wind down, it's been amazing having you as part of this podcast episode, Vlad. What are your 2025 predictions, right, when it comes to automation and labor shortages, right? Do you see AI agents as primarily solving workforce gaps, or are they fundamentally changing how we think about human roles in manufacturing?
Oh, very, very tough questions on today's conversation. So look, I think that, up until earlier this year to, I guess I want to say late 2024, people were still very skeptical around AI, right? A lot of people were dismissive in a lot of my conversations. They were, how would I say, pointing out that yes, ChatGPT is great for my personal use, but how is it going to solve problems in a real environment? I would argue that there's a lot less skepticism now. I think that with the advancements on, again, different platforms, people are starting to see how big of a change it's truly going to be. And I think it's going to have an impact on all areas, right? So when it comes to, I guess, hiring and personnel, every plant that I go to is trying to find people, right? Especially with a technical background, whether that's controls engineers, managers, IT engineers, managers, technicians, operators. Is it going to bridge the gap necessarily between the quote unquote aging workforce and the individuals coming on the plant floor? I think there will be solutions. I think companies will be trying to do it. I don't know if we will necessarily see a huge change, to be honest with you, in 2025. I think our industry, for again, better or for worse, is lagging behind IT and software. So whereas, companies on the software side that I'm talking to have adopted AI, and it's like every software engineer has been purchased, an advanced license and is now able to program with AI. In manufacturing, that's still not the case, at least from what I'm seeing. So I think there's still this kind of like flywheel that's starting up, and a lot of manufacturers are trying solutions, but it will take, I think, 3 to 5 years to fully realize the potential. But again, make no mistake, there's a lot of different proof of concept projects. There's a lot of deployments. People are testing things on, the manufacturer side, the integrator side, the OEM side, even, companies that are, again, auxiliary to manufacturing who are recruiting for manufacturers. They're testing out a lot of different solutions. So I just think it's going to take a little bit more time to adopt, but I think this is the year where a lot of tests are being done. And I really hope, this is my ask for almost everyone, that there's more case studies being released. I want to see the information being published. And like I said, I understand, of course, PII data or, you know, data that is, I want to say, proprietary cannot be exposed, but I think it will help the industry as a whole if we can share more of those case studies and knowledge. And, I'm also trying to push some of my customers, I guess, to disclose that, but it is tough. So
That's great. So, finishing up here, Vlad, turning it a little bit more personal, what would you recommend to people if they wanted to follow your career and get into what you're doing? What would you recommend they do?
oh, follow my career. That's a tough one. I don't know if I would recommend anyone follow someone else's career. I guess in a general sense, maybe to take a step back, I think learn the technical side fairly deep. I think spending the time on the plant floor, I guess if we talk about manufacturing, is extremely important for an engineer, for a technician, regardless of, I guess, like, where you're currently at. Business, extremely important. I guess I went and did an MBA, and that's a whole separate maybe story. But ultimately, I think it's important to be able to make decisions that are not only technically focused. It's important to see the bigger picture. It's important to understand why certain things are done the way they are done. And I would argue a lot of that knowledge, right? If it's, and again, that's maybe a separate discussion, but usually that's not the reason why you would do an MBA. But if you just want the knowledge, I think you can learn a lot of that with the current AI models. And if you spend the time, you have the will, same on the technical side, you can learn almost everything. And I would say, looking a little bit forward, again, I spend a lot of time myself right now with, I want to say, paid chatbots, right? That you can, there's different solutions, of course, from Google and from OpenAI, but there's also applications on top of that that help you even further developing different software. So I think if you're not spending at least some portion of your time seeing what you can build, even I would say with limited programming knowledge, you're definitely missing out. I'm just surprised by how easy it is now to build an application, in Python, an application for your PLCs, an application in Go. Like, it's incredible for all sorts of use cases, right? Not just, again, if you have maybe some fun use cases as you're choosing this career, all the power to you, but spend some time learning for sure.
Absolutely. I've taken back up coding again because I don't need to code because of all the tools that are out there, which is great. And one last thing, what do you do for fun, Vlad? Come on, tell us what you do for fun.
What do I do for fun? I would say, a portion of my time is dedicated to some video games. And very ironically, there's an interesting video game that was showcased at the Prove It conference called Factorio, which is basically building virtual factories. I've sunk so many hours into that game and not because of its like technical capability, but it's just the ability to like scale factories almost infinitely. So I spent a lot of time on that. So yes, it's a huge time sink. So if that's not your cup of tea, I would not recommend it, but it does teach you a lot of principles. And I have a 2-year-old with whom, I try to spend as much time as possible as well. So, that's where all my time goes, so to speak.
Fantastic. So, Vlad, what's the best way for people to be able to get in touch with you and find your podcast and so on? How should they get to you?
Absolutely. I would say LinkedIn is usually the best place to get in touch with me. And if we connect, you can find my email address and send me a note, like I said, over LinkedIn or email. And I'm assuming the link is going to be somewhere in the podcast description. So
Absolutely. We'll make sure it's there.
Vlad, it has been so great having you on. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And we look forward to staying in touch and collaborating with you in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
That's a wrap on this week's episode of the Agentic Insider. Thank you for listening. For show notes and more, please visit agenticinsider.show. To learn more about Iridius, visit iridius.ai. We'll see you next time.